trauma refers to a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or the emotional response to such an event. There are different types of trauma, of course. So you have like physical trauma. This would be like injury to the body that is caused by some external force. You also have emotional or psychological trauma caused by experiences that overwhelm an individual's ability to really cope. What I find in speaking to many people is not the trauma itself, but the ability to cope with such trauma. So whatever the trauma is, the experience that somebody went through is so overwhelming to the individual to the point where they have a lack of ability to cope. I want to talk about trauma because it has a significant impact on us as what people will call Black people around the world globally, and how it affects us and why we find it very difficult to love each other and to come together in unity. Common sources of trauma can be abuse, neglect, a loss of a loved one, perhaps witnessing violence or surviving a disaster. Now, there are different types of psychological trauma. So you have ones that are referred to like acute trauma. This is normally resulting from like a single event, like I mentioned before, maybe having like a car accident. And then you have chronic trauma, which is trauma that has been repeated and prolonged, or exposure to it has been prolonged. This might be something like domestic abuse. Then you also have complex trauma, which is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events. And these are often of an invasive or interpersonal nature. Then you have developmental trauma, which occurs in early life and can disrupt emotional and cognitive development. And there are many, many symptoms of trauma. And these can be triggered by intrusive thoughts or flashbacks, emotional numbness, or detachment. So the effects of trauma have an impact in your daily lives and in relationships, for example. And another one that is quite popular is anxiety, depression, getting irritable. You also get hypervigilance or being easily startled. Let's say there's a bang. It could just be like a balloon bursting and people in the room react differently. Some people just be calm and just look around like it doesn't really have that much of an impact on them. And then you see others that are like, some scream, shout, you see. So that is what we call hypervigilance or being easily startled. Avoidance of reminders of the trauma. So you don't know what trigger is going to cause a reaction from that trauma. Of course, there are many treatment options available. Therapy is one, which can be very trauma focused to deal with like cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe using creativity, music, dance, and other forms or remedies that will help. But you also have like body-based therapies, which relate to like I said, movement and doing things with the body and relaxation, meditation and yoga. There are many, many things that we can look at in terms of forms of therapy. Medication, a lot of people get like antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications. Two of the most popular books that help with this aspect is The Mind Scroll, because a lot of what's going on is mental. And if you can monitor, work with them, study the mind, and start to put into practice what the master teacher teaches us, you will find that you can actually cope with life in general. One of the emerging studies of today in relation to behavior is epigenetics, all right? And epigenetics is the study of biological mechanisms that can switch genes on and off, right? So recent epigenetic studies have shown that stress, socioeconomic deprivation, racism, and other traumatic experiences of our ancestors can play a part in turning on or off certain genes in our DNA. So that is to say, for instance, that the trauma of, say, slavery can be passed on transgenerationally. You didn't have to actually be involved in it yourself, because from generation to generation, the effects have been seen. Now, the concept of epigenetic effects, it refers to the changes in gene expression that are not caused by alterations in the underlying DNA sequence, but rather by the environmental factors that can turn genes on or off. But research in this area suggests that severe trauma and prolonged stress can lead to such epigenetic modifications of genes being turned on or off. It is important to note a few key points, right? They will say that it's a complex subject, so because it's ongoing research. The field of epigenetics, especially in humans and regarding complex social factors like historical trauma, is still developing. This is what they will say. Although they have actually carried out research on animals. So studies have shown compelling evidence for transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of trauma within animals. So they would, I'm sure some of you may have heard of experiments done where they had monkeys, or I think it was monkeys or apes or something, where they were basically carrying out an experiment, and then years later they did the same experiment with others in another country or from another country, and they noticed that the effects of the first experiment, the new sample, it affected them. So although they say direct human studies proving a causal link across multiple generations, example from slavery to present day health disparities, are challenging and ongoing. But the reality is that we know, by way of what we've been taught by the master teacher, Pana Babyanun, that epigenetics is very real. What does that mean? Basically means that don't make what took place or happened many generations ago to determine your future. So there are areas where epigenetic effects and in terms of hypothesis or studied in relation to the historical trauma of colonization and slavery in Black communities. So we do suffer a lot of stress, right? So the way we respond to things, especially under stressful circumstances, will automatically react to basically say that we can cope with anything. And just because we have become so resilient based on the trauma and the type of things our ancestors were put through, it says it does turn on and off certain genes. So these experiences during slavery, and like I mentioned before, ongoing racism, can impact your physical, your physiology, even to what we call the hypothalamic pituitary. That's the adrenaline that deals with your pituitary gland, which regulates the body's stress response, right? So we seem to be vulnerable under certain circumstances and situations. Like I said, it does affect our health. It's even funny because when you even look at even diet and things that we eat, so what you eat, what you put into your body has an impact on your health. It's very crucial to look at diet. And as I said, the correlation between what you put into yourself is like fuel for the body. Or if you had a car, you wouldn't put sand in the petrol tank. So we eat things that are very oily, very meat-based, a lot of sugar, a lot of as I said, starchy stuff, so a lot of rice, and white at that. And white things are generally processed to the point where there's very little nutrition in it. So the diet is very important. There's so much we can go into, but these things are not very good for your health, all right? But again, it's not just these things that you may consider to be trivial. There's all sorts of issues and systemic disadvantages that we face that lead to many epigenetic changes that increase the risk for chronic diseases, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular diseases across generations. Mental health is a big one. Mental health vulnerabilities. And together, when I mentioned the slave master and being given religions, for example, and the fact that the colonizers would give you their form or version of religion, because remember that religion is a lot of the way people have a moral compass, right? Which determines what you do and what you don't do, what's right or what's wrong. And so you have the slave and the slave master worshipping the slave master's God, which doesn't make any sense because that's being drummed into you. And of course, your culture was eradicated or erased from you, your identity. Your names was taken, your original tribal names, cultural aspects of you were stripped off. So epigenetic markers associated with mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, of the slave syndrome, right? So that would be PTSS, right? Post-traumatic slave syndrome. The immune system is compromised a lot. So there are so many aspects to the adverse conditions that our ancestors underwent or went through that lead to epigenetic modifications within our genes that affect us in every shape you can think of, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, our immune system. And all of this results in why we don't, say, for example, trust each other. We don't work together because remember that, just look at what was happening, right? Families were dispersed, taken away from each other, taken to different plantations. So that's in our DNA to the point where we have been taught to be separated, because the whole point of separation or divide and conquer was to basically keep you apart. And that's had an effect. And till this day, we're still suffering. You see why it's very difficult for us to follow what Partner Babyanun is teaching us to do, which is love and unity. Love and unity, because to love yourself when you've been pretty much, your ancestors were taught that they weren't beautiful. They didn't like their hair, the nappy hair, or we call it the natural, what they call it afro. Bleach their skin. The good hair is straight hair. All of these things, it has an impact from your neurodevelopment. That's like your actual, the brain, the way your mind is. And so trauma experienced by parents can really have an impact on the children because it is passed down. So there is a lot to cover on these subjects. So we have to learn that, or at least be mindful and aware that we're healing. Even in recent times with our community, as the Nuwapians being dispersed from our land, that has another level of trauma because imagine after all these years, we were actually starting to find ourselves again and rebuild and have our own environment, starting to speak our own language, starting to live our culture, rebuild, and just be left alone for a change, for a moment to actually be self-governing. And we were very successful, but that wasn't good enough for our adversaries. So they had to disrupt that, much like what happened in the Bible in the Genesis chapter 11 story with Nimrod, where he went back to his father's land, his father Cush, learned his culture, learned his language, and then came back. And it tells you that unified them because language is so key, because when you're dealing with genes, the tones and the way you speak has an effect on your whole being.